You're listening to the Deloitte Business Chemistry Confessions podcast series. Welcome to this week's episode of Deloitte Business Chemistry Confessions. In this series, you'll hear from executives about their perspectives on the CXO role and how it all comes down to one thing: business chemistry. If I mention the word finance, what comes to mind is probably an analytical professional. Consider healthcare, on the other hand, and you might have a picture of a compassionate leader. Sometimes people with certain work styles gravitate toward key industries. Likewise, some corporations and industries seek out one specific kind of worker or thinker. It may seem like a natural reflex to fill your organization with people just like you, but there are some unexpected issues that may arise as a result. Mark Buthman, CFO Emeritus of Kimberly-Clark, spoke with us about his experience as a team builder. During his career, Mark realized that diversity is the key to success. Listen to this story in today's episode, Building Strong Teams.
As an integrator, I do think it's a very unusual dominant characteristic in a CFO. And I go back to my very first year as CFO of Kimberly-Clark, and we did a very similar survey, and I'll use our nomenclature, but around the table, one of the exercises, when you got your survey feedback, you got your dominant characteristic, and you put it on your back. And as I walked around the room, we had about 10 people on my team. Every single person in the room was either the color blue, which was highly analytical, or the color red, which was highly decisive. That was their dominant color. And you think about most finance teams, that's their nature. Well, we had a big reveal, and of course, when I revealed, I was my dominant colors were green and yellow, which is team-oriented and social-oriented. And I remember the thought in my head at that time is, they all have the good colors, and my color isn't as good. I literally thought that in that meeting. My controller at the time, longtime Kimberly-Clark leader, very insightful guy I had looked up to for most of my career that was now on my leadership team, sort of saw my reaction, and he said, "Mark," he said, "we all know," and he said, "that's the role that you play on this team. You get us to do things that we would never do on our own." So if you think about it in that moment as a brand new CFO who was actually younger than I think anybody else around that room, to have one of those veterans point out that the difference in my leadership style was really kind of the gel that brought this team together was very, very insightful and empowering to me. So over time, as I built teams, tried to specifically look for complementary skills. And one of the risks in finance and any leadership team is there's a lot of analytical, decisive leaders around, but that doesn't make for much diversity. It makes for everybody thinking very similarly. So I was very intentional about building leadership teams over time. I was also very intentional at that time. Every deputy I had was male. Not that unusual in a finance organization. By the time I left as CFO, 2/3 of my leadership teams were women. Much less about gender and much more about having a broader array of skills around the table that could work without me necessarily being the primary integrator.
We frequently see teams that are finding challenges in tapping into cognitive diversity. And what I think is interesting is that sometimes they actually have people who are different on the team, but those people feel a lot like Mark describes. I don't want to be the outlier. I don't want to be that one that has the quote unquote wrong colors. They don't want to stand out. And it's easy as a leader to ignore when people are different and not actively encourage them and pull them into the fold. So I really think his story is not only representative of what we frequently see, but also interesting in that the people around him recognized that he was different and actually saw the value in that and made a point of telling him that so that they could start to tap into the power of having differences within a team.
Yeah, I think it fits really well with what we pointed out both in our CXO study and also in our recent HBR article, that when you have a team without diversity, you end up with things like groupthink and cascades where, the discussion just always goes toward whatever the majority is saying. But those same things can happen even when you do have diversity, especially if that diversity is represented by just a few tokens. And I think it really speaks to how important it is for leaders to very directly recognize the importance of those minority perspectives and how valuable they are, as opposed to just saying, well, I did bring them in, so, that's enough.
There's two great leadership behaviors that we see here. The one is recognizing that there is an outlier and stating the value of that individual and how much they can bring. And then the second is what Mark himself did. He said, I sought out complementary skill sets. We oftentimes talk about these 4 patterns of business chemistry and acknowledge that there are opposites in there. The pioneer and the guardian are opposites, the driver and the integrator are opposites. But as we've said before, that term opposite can be so misleading because it sounds like conflict, it sounds oppositional, whereas the real benefit comes from the complementary nature of these things, which Mark is getting at and explicitly looking for.
Yeah, and I think that, while it sounds like maybe, well, yes, of course we should all be doing that, it's not so easy because we're attracted to people who are like us. It's easier to work with those people. So the fact that he knows he has to explicitly make that effort is really important. And I love the fact that he sort of got a bonus prize when he did that. And he got gender diversity into the mix by actually looking not for women, but for people who had different perspectives. And we do find that both among CXOs and general professionals that women are more likely to be integrators than drivers, and men are more likely to be drivers than integrators. So by looking for that different perspective, including some more integrators in the mix, as he said, so he's not the only one, he got women also. And so he's got multiple types of diversity working in his favor now.
In some ways, it's not surprising that Mark is so good at this because he is an integrator and he gets that it's all about people and he really values the different things that folks are bringing to the table. And integrators do typically tend to be the gel that holds a team together. And in this case, he's thinking about the team from a very comprehensive standpoint. Let's listen for some more clues about how Mark harnessed this array of skills around the table.
The CFO of today, in addition to being analytical, decisive, influential, and all of that, I think you have to be a team builder. Talent development is much more important as decisions are pushed down in the organization. The quality and the skills and the leadership attributes of your first and second and third line leaders become much more important because that's where all the action is. You also have to be very clear on setting an agenda and a framework. You might call it tone at the top, because so many decisions are made throughout the organization at the point of attack, so that every single person in the organization knows what your expectations are. Setting a clear, unambiguous agenda on what your expectations are, and then making sure that you've got the people in place with the development process in place to empower the organization, I think that's really important as part of being a CFO in today's environment.
We do all these sessions with key executives, and I would say that talent comes up as one of the top topics in every single one of those conversations. So it's not surprising that we're hearing Mark talk about that. But it's interesting because he's coming back again to that theme of empowerment, which is very much a core to his leadership belief, and I think driven a lot by his integrator perspective, that he does think it's all about the people, and he recognizes that he needs to give them the tools they need in order to make decisions on the ground.
He talks about building teams and developing people. And I think sometimes people think that the reason to do that is altruistic. Like we do that because it's nice for people, or we do that because it's the right thing to do for people. And those are both true, but the reason also to do that is because that's how your organization will succeed.
So let's hear a little bit about how Mark thinks about time and how he manages time constraints.
I think one of the big challenges of being a CFO is you have much more responsibility, breadth of responsibility than you ever have, but you have about half as much time to execute. And what I mean by that is, as a CFO, if you think about your commitments, if you think about the calendar of a CFO, about almost half of your total time available is committed to very important, but not, I'll call them not value-adding activities. So you have probably broader responsibility than you ever had in your career, but you only have half as much time to do it. So the implication is how you use your time and how you use your team is super, super critical, much more critical than at any other point in your career.
One of the interesting things about the CXO study that we did is that we do see a majority of drivers and pioneers in those top C-suite roles. And as you said earlier, with the CFO in particular, we're seeing drivers and guardians. And it led to an interesting discussion that we had before about why is that? It's partly skill, but it's partly aspiration as well. And hearing Mark talk here, it becomes very clear that this is not an easy job. Being an executive in the C-suite is not something that everybody wants to sign up for. You're doing, twice the work with half the time. I mean, that is a big burden to take on.
Yeah, my blood pressure is rising just listening to him talk about that. The idea that I would need to make a lot of decisions very quickly, and that is one of the things that we see among CXOs in our study, that they do tend to make decisions more quickly and without worrying about whether they're popular all the time. And I think his ability to do that, he's maybe channeling his pioneer side a little bit, because integrators sometimes have a tough time with that because they want to gather so much different input. But yeah, not everybody wants to be in that kind of a role.
I had a conversation with a CEO of a very large company with a similar profile, actually, to Mark. So she is primarily an integrator, but secondary pioneer. And one of the things she said was, when I took the CEO role, one of the hardest things for me was needing to make those quick decisions and be a little bit more blunt than I'm used to being. And I had to be more driver than I've ever been in the past. And so even though it's not really my style, I felt that I had to go there simply to be able to get things done.
I think there are lots of reasons that we see certain types gravitating toward these roles and other types, ending up there some of the time, but other times deciding, the path for me is different because I have different preferences and I want to do things in a different way.
The way Mark's describing his time and his job here, it does come across as something that's very stressful. And it's been interesting to see the stress research as well on this, because our pioneers and drivers tend to be much more comfortable with stress in general than our integrators and guardians. And of course, Mark here has a mix of both. So he's clearly aware of it. He's feeling the stress, and the way he's managing it is by empowering this team. And the team is essentially a safety net of sorts to make sure that the right decisions are still being made, even if he doesn't have enough time to carefully consider them himself.
Yeah, and I think he's just emphasizing again that developing people is not just for their benefit, it's for your benefit as a leader, because if you have developed your people well, that you can trust them to make those decisions and get things done without you having to be the one to always do them.
The dominant patterns that we see are actually the pioneer, followed by then the driver, or in the case of the CFO role, as you mentioned before, that driver guardian. The confession is in. Building strong teams is an example of how all of the business chemistry types play an important role in corporate America. Be sure to tune in for our next episode. And if you'd like to hear more stories and thoughts from today's leaders, you can also check out Deloitte's award-winning Resilient podcast. Find both on Deloitte.com, Stitcher, or Apple's podcast app.
This podcast is provided by Deloitte and is intended to provide general information only. This podcast is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, go to deloitte.com/about.